My name's Sophie Seck. I'm the Senior Manager of Ethics and Compliance at Medicines Australia. Really excited to be here, and thank you very much for spending an hour and a half with us this morning. I know how busy this time is. I'm joined by my colleague, Lucy O'Brien, and together we form the Ethics and Compliance team at MA. So we have over 300 people registered to attend this session, which is marvelous, and it makes Lucy and myself very, very happy to know that everyone is so engaged and interested in the work that we do and interested in getting it right, putting your ethical feet forward. But with that broad audience of over 300 people, just acknowledging also that some of you have really deep, extensive, rich knowledge, historical knowledge of the code and scientific exchange. And potentially others will be more new to the party, new to the industry, and may have not intersected to the same degree. We hope that today's session will have something for everyone, but I'm just cognizant of the different layers and levels of knowledge coming into this info session today. For those who are not as aware about the code and how it fits in the regulatory framework and all the bits and pieces, we've got plenty of resources online for you to catch up. So today is all about education and support. So guiding industry to make ethical decisions, to be able to apply the code in practice and to think about the code principles and risks to guide you into making some really great decisions. And also to make you aware of further support and tools and resources that we have. So whilst Lucy and I are ethics and compliance is obviously part of our role, our real focus and emphasis is on education, and this is part of our suite of educational offerings that we do for industry. So I'd like to acknowledge Ngunnawal people, and as the traditional custodians of the land that I'm meeting on, and also recognise other people and families with connections to the land of the ACT and region. As part of our reconciliation journey, please feel free and comfortable to acknowledge the country on which you are meeting. So probably the chat box is great for that. And I also wish to acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have used learning practices such as this sharing of knowledge event that we are hosting on this land for thousands and thousands of years. So just 30 seconds of housekeeping. You should find the Q&A buttons at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to ask a question, could we encourage you to use those rather than the chat box, because we miss them a little bit if they get into the chat box. So use the chat for chatting. We are recording today's session. This session will replace the Code Info session that is currently hosted on our Code Resource Toolkit on Scientific Exchange. So we delivered that in June 2022, so pretty much exactly 3 years ago. And obviously in that 3 years, time and work practices evolve, as well as we now have edition 20 of the code and not edition 19. So we will be removing that one shortly and replacing it with this one. We've also got some Zoom generated captions that are enabled today. So those captions will appear text at the bottom of the screen, and the video, which you can switch on and off. But note the accuracy is not 100% guaranteed because it's a machine generated tool that we're using. And I'd also like to highlight the Code Help Desk for any further questions that you have stemming from today's content. Lucy and I are really happy to listen and chat and email back and forth as you need. So this is the breakup of today's session, the agenda. We quite like the what, who, when, why, where approach to learning. It feels like if you use those 5 foundational fingers, you can kind of cover content quite well. So we will dive straight into what is a scientific exchange, and touch upon the why and look around the globe and kind of understand where we sit in that global context. Then we'll go into the who. So who are the givers and who are the receivers of scientific exchange? So who can deliver? and we'll touch quickly on the when and the where. And then we'll dive into the how, which is kind of a bit more of the meatier section of the session. We'll talk about two-way focus and two-way communication, and other aspects. And then we'll highlight 2 scenarios where we'll try and kind of thread together some of the learnings into these scenarios and work together through those, and time at the end for some Q&A. I do need to mention a caveat. As I said, this Code Info session is for educational purposes only. If we provide answers or guidance in this session, the guidance that we're giving is not binding. It's offered in good faith to support your own decision making. So it's the responsibility of every company to work within the principles of the code and to make your own decisions about how your activities, decisions, and content are appropriate, compliant, and ethical. So only the Code of Conduct Committee, which is independent of us, can make a decision on whether the code has been breached or not. So let's hop in. So what is scientific exchange? So just before we go into what it is, as you know, we've transitioned from edition 19 of the Code of Conduct to edition 20. That edition 20 came into effect in March. So just highlighting some of the changes related to scientific exchange that were made. So we have improved the definition of scientific exchange, and we have improved the section of scientific exchange in edition 20. And the reasons were to provide industry with more clarity. So to improve clarity and reduce ambiguity. There is now a focus, an articulated focus on two-way communication. So bringing the exchange back into scientific exchange. Oversight by the medical director or their delegate has been retained, as is the requirement for scientific exchange to be non-promotional. So that has not changed. So while the scientific exchange is predominantly undertaken with healthcare professionals, in the code review, we did recognise that healthcare professionals are not the only participants who can receive or participate in scientific exchange with the pharmaceutical industry. And this was alluded to in edition 19. So in the movement to edition 20, there's been some rephrasing and a little bit more flexibility built in to recognise that that scientific exchange can be undertaken with other stakeholders that are not entirely and only exclusively healthcare professionals. There's a couple of caveats, but either way, it's allowed for that flexibility. And the other change that I'll talk about is it's allowed a little bit more flexibility about who in your company can deliver scientific exchange. It's worth noting that scientific exchange in Code Edition 19 was Section 8, and now it's Section 7. So what is scientific exchange? It is the legitimate exchange of medical and scientific information delivered in a non-promotional manner. It concerns mostly, but not limited to, unregistered products or their use. So this definition is embedded in our code. It's in the glossary. As I suggested before, it is an improvement on the previous definition. The information or activity must be without any reasonable likelihood to influence the intent to prescribe or to use a product, and must not constitute promotion. So you can see a common strong theme in that definition about it being non-promotional. That's not only in the first sentence, but it was also reinforced through the second sentence. So that's probably the big major takeaway that we'll be discussing today. So examples of activities that are likely to involve scientific exchange, for example, responding to medical information inquiries, such as an inquiry from a healthcare professional wishing to run their own study, disease awareness and educational activities, for example, delivering a presentation on a specific disease area, research findings and classes of drugs used to treat that disease, discussion of product pipeline and corporate commitments to research, including, for example, a presentation to healthcare professionals, giving an overview of products in development without making any claims in relation to the results of the trials. Satellite symposia during official Congress programs, advisory boards, and also identifying investigators for clinical trials. So those examples were listed in Code Edition 19 as examples. We've removed them from Code Edition 20. That's of no consequence. It just felt like we didn't need to write examples of scientific exchange inside the actual code itself. We can talk about it. We can use it in guidance. We just removed them. So let's think about why the case, what is the case for scientific exchange? So our industry values transparency, as you would know, and acknowledges the importance of keeping the scientific community and the public informed about developments in medical and scientific research. So given our role as innovators and our significant investment in this area, we are really well placed to share that progress. So scientific exchange enables us to do so responsibly. In other words, it can be appropriate to exchange scientific information concerning a pharmaceutical product, including dissemination of investigational findings in certain contexts, not all contexts. It's worth noting that some companies will have public disclosure obligations as part of their the Australian Stock Exchange. And those commitments will mean that they will need to provide information to their shareholders concerning their products, their pipeline drugs, and scientific progress. But it's important to note that aside, our foremost responsibility is to operate within the boundaries of the law. So that trumps the need to share information. So as innovators with significant investment in research, we must ensure that any sharing of information is done in accordance with legal and regulatory requirements. This is greater in importance than the responsibility to inform the scientific, medical, and patient community about developments in medical and scientific research. So as you'll be aware, the Therapeutic Goods Act underpins the Medicines Australia Code of Conduct, and our code is generally consistent with the Act. So in keeping with that Australian regulatory approach, the code also reinforces the same. That is, one must not promote a therapeutic good or its use to healthcare professionals if it is unapproved or off-label. So scientific exchange enables us to exchange the science and the medical information responsibly on unapproved goods or uses. So up there you can see overarching principle 6 at the top of the slide, and that I've highlighted some bits, but that confirms our responsibility to be consistent with legislative requirements. So when we're talking about being non-promotional or avoiding promotion, it's quite a blanket statement, and everyone gets that concept, I think. But it's kind of more helpful if we unpack what that means. So, we have had feedback from other Code Info sessions saying it would be really helpful if you just stop saying it has to be non-promotional. Can you just tell us what that looks like in all the different contexts? And it's a little bit hard to do, but we will go further than saying it needs to be non-promotional today. So on the screen you can see 3 definitions that relate to promotion. Now, promotion, the definition from the code, is consistent with the way advertise is defined in the Therapeutic Goods Act. So they are very much reflective of each other. And then the code goes on to define promotion, promotional or promotional claim, and also what promotional material is. So there's quite a few ways to cut the cake, but it is a very broad definition. And I think that that's really important to note. And before we go further, I just wanted to pause for a second and see if anyone's stopped to think about why we have this regulatory approach. Like it's very accepted that we do have it, and then we try to work within it. But what's the reason for the whole point of not promoting unapproved use or unapproved products? So, we would suggest that patient safety has something to do with it. So regulatory authorities like the TGA in Australia or the FDA in the US, etc., they do require rigorous evidence to prove a medicine is safe, is effective and appropriate to use before it can be marketed. And they do a pretty good job at that. So promoting a product before this process is complete risks exposing patients to known or harmful side effects. So ultimately, it does play a role in protecting patient safety. It also ensures scientific integrity. So marketing unapproved products or uses undermines the scientific and clinical evaluation process. It could encourage the use of medicine without sufficient supporting evidence, which may lead to poor outcomes or delay more effective treatment. It also reinforces our legal and ethical accountability. So promoting unapproved medicines could be considered misleading, it could be considered deceptive or even fraudulent, depending on which jurisdiction you're working in, especially if the claims are not supported by adequate data. So this creates a liability for companies and can erode public trust in our industry. And it also instills local regulatory oversight. So even if a medicine or indication is approved in another country, local regulators may not have yet reviewed it, and local regulators will want to maintain oversight tailored to their local population, our local health system, and our safety standards, which may differ from other jurisdictions. So there's good reason why this approach is in place, and it also enables us to build and nurture the trust that we seek in the pharmaceutical industry. So whilst we'll cover some foundational concepts today, the main, if you came away from today's session with anything, the focus, I would suggest that it would be worth highlighting that the focus of this session is exploring the risk that scientific exchange could be seen as promotional. It's probably the biggest risk that one needs to manage when undertaking scientific exchange. So we will touch on how to identify these risks, and noting when we talk about that, they might be real, they might be perceived risks, or they might be potential. So real, likely, or perceived. Many of Section 7 on scientific exchange in the code, many of those principles are there to help reduce and manage these risks in the context of scientific exchange. So they are a way of distilling some key principles to help companies ensure that they are on the right track for not promoting unapproved or off-label medicines. So, and it's worth noting, in addition, the resource that we have that dropped, I think, in March, the frequently asked questions on scientific exchange also offers some practical considerations to help guide that risk-based decision making. So looking at that, you've got a risk meter, obviously low risk on the left, high risk on the right, and I'm talking about the risk of the activity being perceived to be promotional, or it actually being promotional. So you've obviously got proactive, we will go into this in a bit more detail, but proactive scientific exchange. So exchange initiated by a company, unsolicited, not responding to a request, is going to throw that activity into a higher risk category. If you are delivering scientific exchange to and with a broad and a large audience, it's probably going to be riskier that it will be perceived to be promotional. It's harder to identify and understand the thinking in a broad, large audience. If you are talking about or exploring data related to unapproved or off-label, if the discussion centres around those things, then yes, it's going to be a high-risk environment. If you are presenting clinical trial results, especially if it's just on one study of which your drug features and features favourably, then that will also likely throw that activity into a higher risk of being perceived to be promotional. On the flip side, you can imagine a reactive exchange. So a healthcare professional calls up and asks a question. They speak to MedInfo. MedInfo answer that question responsibly, ethically, non-promotionally, as they are trained to do. It's a one-to-one discussion. it's very easy to ensure that everyone's got the information has been exchanged properly. Let's say you're even talking about an on-label or an approved product. That's pretty easy. And maybe if the activity was not so focused on one particular study, but expanded beyond that one study and kind of put it into context and looked at the breadth of studies and a wider context and less of a focus on that one that your pipeline drug did favourably, then that would be a lower risk. So they're the kind of ways to think through scientific exchange. And high risk doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means that you really need to think really well through the activity and figure out how to mitigate those risks and how to see if you can slide the risk profile further down to the that direction. And when we're talking about risk, it's not just the level of risk, it's also the likelihood of that risk being realised. So in this case, let's talk about a complaint being made. So who might raise a complaint about that scientific exchange? Who might think that that activity was promotional? And what would motivate them to do so? So if you are challenged on whether your activity slid into being or perceived or was received in a promotional manner, and how would you justify your approach? So documenting and thinking about all these things prior to delivering and participating in scientific exchange is really important because it helps you rationalize, defend, demonstrate, and sets you up for success in terms of acting ethically and sharing information in an ethical, compliant manner. So let's just quickly touch on the global context. So we're not alone in this approach. We're not unique. There is generally across the world a united approach that there should be no promotion of unapproved goods or their use. So that little snip up there is a grab from the IFPMA Code of Practice. The IFPMA being the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations. All those in Navy, those countries and regions in Navy on the screen are members of the IFPMA, and many of the non-members actually aspire to being members, and they often take the IFPMA code to be their pseudo code if they don't have one. So there is an international community. We do connect regularly on an ethics and integrity level, and our code is aligned with that international code. So it's very much a universal global approach. So UK has the same approach, Europe has the same approach, the USA has a similar approach, and Asia as well. And I haven't actually canvassed every single country, I apologise, but you know, in general, that's the flavour. It's probably on an international conversation, you know, the same. So whilst we will take the same stance, which is consistently adopted throughout the major global regions, what is not consistent, though, between those regions will be the definition of advertising and promotion and how it is interpreted by those local regulatory authorities. So a common principle approach, but they may translate into slight differences. And I've just circled New Zealand there to demonstrate the differences in interpretation and understanding. So, for example, in New Zealand, Section 20 of their Medicines Act, 1981, prohibits the promotion of unregistered medicines. No surprise. However, MedSafe, which is the New Zealand regulator, has produced guidance, which is on their website, that interprets Section 20 to say that provision of any information relating to unapproved medicines or the potential availability of medicines in the future at a scientific, clinical, professional conferences would be regarded as a breach of the Act, regardless of the content or the audience. So this kind of approach differs from our approach. So in an Australian setting, exchanging information about unregistered medicines is understood as scientific exchange if it's done under the auspice of scientific exchange. Whilst this activity comes with strict guardrails that are identified in Section 7, it is possible. So there have been recent there's a recent article a couple of weeks ago that signalled an article that reported on the government signalling a interest in changing that New Zealand approach to make it, well, and that will bring them more aligned with the international community and create greater consistency with the way that we are able to talk about unapproved products and usages. So that's a good step forward, especially for the healthcare professionals in New Zealand. And also the other thing from the world was, I found this quite useful. This is the communications from firms regarding scientific information on unapproved uses of cleared medical products. So that's a FAQ from the FDA. It's USA based. It's not applicable here. And obviously they have quite a different landscape, but there are still some quite interesting bits and pieces in that document, and it was published in January 2025, so it's not very old. So section 2 of the webinar will look at the who, the givers and receivers of scientific exchange. So who can receive scientific exchange? So as I mentioned before, edition 20 evolved to allow the people on the receiving end of a scientific exchange to be more than just healthcare professionals. So they could be a relevant stakeholder. It's not necessarily limited to exclusively to healthcare professionals, but I would suggest that they are probably remain the dominant audience of whom we exchange the science with. Now, healthcare professionals are defined in the code, which is consistent with the way healthcare professionals are defined in the Therapeutic Goods Act. We've also got the scientific community, obviously the researchers, including the trial participants. Now, the trial participants won't have, most of them won't have a medical degree, but they are part of the science. And other relevant stakeholders. So Section 10D does outline some relevant stakeholders. It doesn't, and some of those include members of government or relevant government agency, patient organisations and patient advocacy groups, and healthcare professional organisations. It's not limited exclusively to those 3 dot points. The code allows a company to decide on who that stakeholder might be and how is it relevant to their role. So it's up to a company to decide on the relevance of the proposed scientific exchange to the stakeholder. And context is key here. So up there is section 7B, and I've just highlighted that bit from the code that talks about the relevant stakeholders. So as long as information and material that's provided is made available to those stakeholders whose need for or interest in can reasonably be assumed for the conduct of their role, as well as material should be tailored to the audience to whom it is directed. So a member of government, for example, will not have the same breadth of experience in data analysis as a specialist healthcare professional. So we do need to be cognizant of tailoring what kind of information we're delivering, why we're delivering it, and it doesn't necessarily need to be exactly the same. So what you communicate to a healthcare professional might be different, and probably should be different, to how you would communicate that same science to the CEO of a patient organisation, for example. So they'll have different roles and different needs and different levels of understanding. So on the other side, who can give scientific exchange? So all scientific exchange needs to be overseen by the company medical director or their delegate. So they can delegate this responsibility to another person. And overseen doesn't mean I need to see you. It doesn't mean they need to do it. As long as they have oversight of that activity, then that's adequate. How you define in your company what that looks like is your choice. So the code doesn't step out. That means a written signature or a stamped approval. Companies will have their own organisational processes to figure out how that responsibility looks like. So another way of thinking about that oversight, like why do we have the medical director at the top of the chain? If you think about all the bits and pieces in Section 7, as I mentioned before, they're kind of all sitting there in order to allow and support a company to put their best foot forward and deliver information ethically. So in a way, oversight by the company medical director is a good, robust mechanism to ensure that the scientific exchange activity is as it is intended to be. So you've also got then the company medical department are clearly set up and trained and ready to deliver scientific exchange. Edition 20 allows for other non-promotional roles to deliver and give scientific exchange if relevant. Now, the examples outlined in Section 7, so they gave examples such as market access roles or such as regulatory affairs. Edition 20 also introduced another definition called a non-promotional role. And so we've defined that as a role that's not commercial in intent and doesn't have a likelihood to influence the intent to prescribe or use a product. I mean, most people say commercial, non-commercial, but it's trying to say, again, how you organise your own businesses, how your companies are structured. You may have market access reporting to the head of commercial. I'm not sure, but that doesn't rule out the market access person from delivering ethical scientific exchange just because they report to a commercial role. So it does allow you some flexibility, but to decide on who is the most appropriate person. And obviously any exchange that they deliver needs to be overseen by the company medical director or their delegate. So you've still got that check and balance in place. So as I just mentioned, it's up to the company to decide on the appropriate personnel. And this flexibility caters for different organisational structures and roles within companies. So scientific exchange and the separation of personnel. So establishing clear roles and responsibilities is a key part of managing the risk of being perceived that we are unintentionally or incidentally promoting off-label or unapproved products. So it does help ensure that information is exchanged in a way that is unlikely to be interpreted as promotional or advertising in nature. So this structure provides an appropriate separation of activities. So much like the corporate sector manages conflicts of interest by, if the conflict is unmanageable, the person will be removed from the activity where they have a conflict. So in the same vein, identifying and guiding the right individuals to deliver the neutral, non-promotional information helps manage the actual risk, but also the potential and perceived risks of that activity being promotion. So that's really the reason why we have it. And I'll give you a minute to read this hypothetical, and then we have a poll. And I'm just interested in your thoughts and feelings today, not so much the answer is right or wrong. So have a read, and the question is, how comfortable are you with a MSL engaging in scientific exchange while their sales colleague is present? So in this hypothetical, I haven't given you really enough information, in my view, to provide a level of comfort with that situation. Like, everything is context dependent, and I've given you a very, very brief overview. So, the code addresses who delivers scientific exchange and who receives it, but it is silent on whether a person in a promotional role needs to leave the room, needs to leave the space, needs to leave the building to allow for scientific exchange to occur. So for all the reasons outlined already, companies will decide on how they want to manage this separation of roles. and how this applies to physically working in the same space in a context like the trade display. So many policies and procedures will not allow for this tandem approach, and this is understandable. It mitigates the risk of company personnel promoting off-label to prescribers. It also helps preserve the neutrality of MSLs by avoiding role blurring. So if there's no real need for it to happen, no critical need for it to happen, why would you try and blend two roles where one is not promotional and the other one is? So this topic is addressed as a question in the FAQ guidance that dropped on the interactive code back in March. So it's worth having a read through. And before we move on, it's also like, think about some different contexts. So because the code is silent on this, it doesn't mean you can and it doesn't mean you can't. But you understand now the intent of why we have separation of roles. So for a large scientific exchange event, I'm going to go extreme here. So large scientific exchange event or presentation, you might need more hands on deck. And logistically, this might be challenging to eliminate all personnel in promotional roles. So if your salesperson was to be present in the room, like maybe they're staffing the door or playing some kind of discrete AV Slido role, or an event support logistical capacity, like does their physical presence instantly throw the whole content and the whole activity into being a promotional exchange? I would suggest that would be an extreme perception, and I would suggest it wouldn't. But in a smaller meeting, their physical presence will be more conspicuous. There is no need for the salesperson to be there, in my view. It's less necessary. It's also harder to defend. Why are they there? Are they listening? Are they, and it doesn't help preserve the neutrality of the MSL. So I've just gone from one extreme to the other, but just to demonstrate that everything is context dependent, and many companies will choose not to do that tandem approach for good reason. But there is nothing in the code that goes to that level of detail. So where and when can scientific exchange occur? So this is just the where and the when. It can happen anywhere. So venue choice should follow the code principles, which is encaptured in section 4.5. It may be part of a symposium, or it may be a one-to-one meeting. It might be in the healthcare professionals practice. It might be in the CEO office of, or the, a leadership, an office in the patient organisation. Need to consider privacy. So we're not speaking publicly about scientific exchange. So privacy of audio, so people don't overhear our conversations. It's meant to be an exchange between the two parties, and it should be clearly distinguished from promotional activities. Scientific exchange can happen anytime as well. So the code does not address this directly. Scientific exchange may occur at any stage of a medicine's life cycle, not just for unapproved uses or prior to TGA approval. Now, I am talking a lot about unapproved use and unapproved products. Obviously, scientific exchange is not limited to that. But it does, in my view, represent, it is where the heart of scientific exchange lies. It is, if you are going to discuss, share medical and scientific information about anything that's unapproved, an unapproved use or an unapproved product, the only way to do it is through scientific exchange. There are other ways to talk about on-label and approved products with healthcare professionals. So does scientific exchange differ when discussing approved products and information? So I'm kind of testing your understanding here. So no, the scientific exchange doesn't have, a section for approved and a section for unapproved. But when the audience is healthcare professionals, managing the risk of perceived promotion becomes less critical. So I'm back to the risk mantra at the moment. So why is that because promotion to healthcare professionals on approved products and indications is allowed. So let's just take that thought and extend ourselves a little bit. What I'm hoping that this communicates what I'm trying to say. We're looking at the activity, the code, and the risk, and we're kind of trying to understand and know what applies to what we're doing. So this is one decision-making tree that can kind of help you understand how it works. So is the science that you're wishing to exchange or needing to exchange, is it about an unapproved product or use? If the answer is yes, then we go straight to scientific exchange section 7. That's it. If it is not about an unapproved product or use, then we have to think about the healthcare professional. The audience. Are we exchanging it with a healthcare professional, that's science? Yes. So I've gone down to the bottom layer now and to the left. The perceived promotion is less of a concern, because even if the activity was intended as scientific exchange, delivered as scientific exchange, being perceived to be promotional doesn't automatically result in a compliance issue, in my view, because ultimately we are allowed to promote to a healthcare professional in accordance, obviously, with all the standards that we have in the code. But it hasn't triggered an instant breach, for example. Whereas if the audience that you're talking to is a patient organisation or any other relevant stakeholder that is a non-HCP, then obviously there should be no promotion at all. So therefore the risk remains. It needs to be strictly non-promotional. So I would suggest that most of the scientific exchange that we're talking about today is in the purple section. It is about unapproved, going to section 7, but it doesn't eliminate the other areas. So I just wanted to throw that in. Hopefully it's helpful. So let's hop into the how. So rules of engagement for scientific exchange. It's really important that scientific exchange looks like scientific exchange. It should be clear to any healthcare professional or stakeholder that the information that's being shared with them is provided as science and is not being provided to influence or to promote. It shouldn't be casually dropped into promotional conversations. It should ideally stand on its own and not be blended with any other purpose. And this obviously helps protect a company from being accused or of the activity being thought of as promotional. So the code lays out some principles to follow, which helps us to achieve this. So we've got the right company, the right people. We've talked about that. Company medical department personnel, non-promotional roles possible, not sales, not commercial, and overseen by the medical director. Being very clear. If the information is provided about unregistered products or unapproved uses, it must be clearly identified. An HCP needs to understand if any product or indication being discussed is not registered or is off-label. For example, if a company was to provide access to medical literature, which refers to a product or indication not approved in Australia, an accompanying cover page or an email or a pop-up box or an appropriate alert or disclosure to inform that recipient that the information being provided refers to off-label use or a non-registered product. Scientific exchange can be proactive and reactive. There is no change to edition 20. It reflects exactly the same approach. This was in place in edition 19. So reactive scientific exchange is obviously an activity that's initiated independently of the pharmaceutical company, and the company is responding with information to respond to that request, and that request should be unsolicited. So that's the true reality of reactive scientific exchange, and that's the bit in the code that talks about. So it's reasonable for companies to provide such information to relevant stakeholders who are seeking clarity and or additional information. On the other side, we've got proactive scientific exchange prompted by a company. and that company anticipates and delivers scientific information. So that's included in the code in B. So it is reasonable for companies to anticipate the needs of those stakeholders. Now, you're still delivering scientific exchange in the same way, but obviously there's quite a big difference in the risk profile between reactive scientific exchange and proactive scientific exchange. Obviously, the reactive scientific exchange is going to be pretty hard if a HCP calls you up and asks you a question about trial results. If you were to answer that in a non-promotional database scientific way by the right people, it would be pretty hard to claim that that company is trying to promote their product. They didn't initiate the contact. They answered accurately, factually, scientifically. So they have taken no steps to proactively distribute or make people aware of those results. Obviously, proactive scientific exchange can be done, should be done in certain circumstances. Companies shouldn't be too reluctant to initiate proactive scientific exchange for all the reasons that we talked about at the beginning of the webinar, but it just has a higher risk profile, and so it needs a lot more scrutiny to mitigate the risk of it being perceived as promotional. And here we are. We do talk about risk-based decision making a lot in my work. So as I just mentioned, proactive scientific exchange carries a high risk of it being perceived as promotional. So the FAQ guidance document has these questions, and I think they're really useful for a company to think about and examine prior to going forward with proactive scientific exchange. What is the rationale for the exchange being proactive? Why does that stakeholder need it? Why is it? How is it relevant to their role? And how can we demonstrate if a complaint is made, or if the stakeholder on the receiving end feels or communicates that they feel that this has gone beyond scientific exchange and gone into a breach of the code? How would you rationalize your need to bring that information forward to that stakeholder? As I mentioned before, why does the stakeholder need the information? How can they demonstrate that that stakeholder needs the information? Do you know that they need it, or are you guessing that they need it? How are you making the decision that that stakeholder has needs that need to be anticipated? What opportunities are available for two-way communication between the company and the stakeholder? So how is it an exchange rather than pushing out one-way information? How will proactively engaging in scientific exchange improve patient care? Or will it improve access to medicine? Or will it support quality use of medicines? Or will it assist research? Or will it assist the stakeholder in budgetary planning? Or will it do a multitude of all those activities? So they're the kind of reasons that the code sets out as why you would engage in scientific exchange. So as a result of the exchange, and this is the last, the good question, is it likely that the person receiving that information might be persuaded or encouraged to use or prescribe the product? And that's probably worth getting a viewpoint from other people. Diverse perspectives from other groups of people, and not just our own companies or not just our own MedInfo teams, is quite useful to try and just get a sense check about whether the information you're communicating could be understood as being promotional. And the big hot question for this webinar is, what is two-way exchange? Or what is two-way communication? So this is the grab from the code. It says the intent of such activities must be non-promotional, with a focus on exchange being two-way communication. So communication should be a true exchange. It shouldn't be a one-way delivery. So it's bringing, as I mentioned before, the exchange back into scientific exchange. Both parties should be able to ask questions and to clarify the content. Two-way communication isn't limited to one-to-one meetings or defined formats. So two-way doesn't necessarily mean one-to-one. It just means a communication channel, a flow, an ability, an opportunity, and a really good opportunity for both parties to be able to talk and communicate. When we're trying to be systems neutral, so the format doesn't matter how the communication takes place. It could be via email, it could be over the phone, it could be in person, it could be in a crowd or an audience during a Q&A session. There are many ways to think about and achieve a two-way communication. And as much as everyone would really like to know how many minutes of a Q&A session should be there in a 1 hour scientific exchange activity, I can't tell you because I don't know, because you need to decide. And I'm really sorry to not, give you that prescriptive detail, but companies need to think about what they're doing, the context, what you're delivering, and think about the ways that you can embed and include a Q&A session that's meaningful and open to all in your sessions. So the code doesn't go into that prescriptive level of a percentage of time needs to be dedicated to Q&A. But as a company, I know many companies have thought this through and have created policies and procedures to address what they believe is ample two-way communication. So the way, I think it's a really useful lens to evaluate scientific exchange. So it discourages one-way tactics like an EDM, an electronic direct mail. So, let's email the broad database about this scientific information that's really important that everyone needs to know. It helps reduce the risk of your communication being received as promotional. And in the true spirit of two-way exchange, I thought I'd throw the baton over to you after I've been talking for an hour and stop the one-way delivery. So I've given you 3 scenarios there and some very simple answers. And it's just your feelings and thoughts. There's no, I will tell you my feelings and thoughts afterwards, but I'll give you a couple of minutes to read through those scenarios. But let's look at scenario A. So a scientific exchange presentation allows, 55 minutes with 5 minutes of Q&A. Now, it does allow for a Q&A, so it does allow for a two-way exchange. I suppose the question is there ample focus on that two-way communication? And I would suggest it is unlikely. I would think that does not, 5 minutes out of 60 is probably enough for one question to be asked. I would think that proportion is a bit out of line with a focus on two-way communication. But that's my personal view, non-binding. But I think 88% of you agree with that. Scenario B, interesting. So a scientific exchange presentation encourages audience participation through electronic polling, where participants indicate their opinion via a quiz to questions posed by the speaker. So I suppose I framed that. So yes, there is a two-way communication happening. If the speaker is asking questions via a quiz, so the speaker is asking the question about your opinion and you're just answering it and popping it in, is there enough, I suppose, opportunity as the member of the audience to be able to ask questions about what you're hearing about? Or are you just responding to a predetermined quiz? So it might look like active engagement and feel like active engagement, but is it truly a meaningful exchange? So is there a genuine opportunity for the person in the audience to ask a question or clarify the science that they're hearing about. And I would suggest that in the very small context that I've given you, that opportunity hasn't been granted to them. So I would be tinkering with that model to give more of a focus on two-way communication rather than just an engagement tool to ensure people are participating and engaged in the content. Again, non-binding, personal view. Scenario C, yes, and there was some things in the chat that we need more context to make an appropriate call, and trying to keep it simple stupid today, so I apologize, but hopefully it provokes some thoughts. So following a one-to-one call between an MSL and an HCP, a disease state A is discussed. The MSL sends a triggered email afterwards saying, thanks for the chat. If you'd like to learn more about the data for this inhibitor for that disease state, click here. Now, is there ample focus on two-way communication? It depends on which way you look at it. A perspective is that it's a continuation of a two-way exchange. So a one-to-one chat is a really great groundwork for scientific exchange. If they discussed the inhibitor and the disease state, then it is a continuation and a follow-up of that one-to-one, two-way exchange, in my view, if it's done relatively shortly after that face-to-face. If that information is relevant to this, if it's not relevant to the discussion, then it's not a continuation really of the two-way exchange, or arguably it's not. I suppose that, I would suggest that there should be a clear invitation for the HCP to ask questions or to continue the exchange in any form. So just because they've clicked on the link which has taken them to the data doesn't mean they can't ask a question back in that one-to-one continuation of that two-way exchange. So that's one way of looking at it. But yeah, I think only 29% of you agreed with me on that one. So that is very interesting, ethical. We might have to do a little bit more ethical crunches on two-way communication. Thanks, guys, for your input. So how about balance in scientific exchange? So is balance necessary in scientific exchange materials? I mean, I'm being the advocate here, like there are no promotional claims. It's not promotional. We're not discussing efficacy. We don't have any purpose or intent to encourage the use. So everything about balance in the code is all kind of tied to product promotion and promotional materials. And the guidance is written related to product materials. So I don't think we need to provide balance in scientific exchange. It's a different kettle of fish. Wrong. The answer is yes, we do need to include balance in scientific exchange materials. And why is that? Because overarching principle 3 makes sure that all materials, all our company communications remain balanced. It's the best way to do things. You can't, we're trying not to over egg something and undercook something else. Balance in all materials, including scientific exchange materials, is important. This is also confirmed through overarching principle 7, which talks a lot about supporting proper assessment of their risks and benefits. And that doesn't mean just because it's an unapproved product or an unapproved use doesn't mean that doesn't apply. It also talks about product and safety information being included. So, and the definition of balance is proportional weight to the risks and benefits. So I think the answer is clear that any material that's delivered as part of the scientific exchange needs to be balanced. How about the question about mandatories? Now, I'm talking about the required inclusions that are set out in section 2.1. Are they required in scientific exchange materials? So the answer is no, they are not required. Scientific exchange materials are non-promotional, so they are not covered under section 2.1. However, they may still be appropriate. They may be useful, they may be relevant, they may help your material, and they may help the balance of your material. depending on what content you're trying to communicate. So importantly, including mandatories does not automatically make the material promotional. And that was a bit of a worry that came up when we went to, when we did the code review. So by including some elements of the mandatories or all of the mandatories, it does not trigger the shift from being scientific exchange, neutral material to promotional materials. That is defined differently. It's defined in our glossary, which I posted on the slide deck before. So don't be too afraid to consider what inclusions make your piece balanced and helpful for the people on the receiving end. Great, let's go through 2 quick scenarios. So sharing clinical trial information. We've got a really good notes from the help desk on this. It's note for the help desk 44, I think. You know, it is worth talking about because it's difficult to present late stage clinical trial results for a particular product in a non-promotional manner. Now, it's not impossible. It doesn't rule it out, but it's just difficult and it's tricky. So our general advice is that sharing efficacy data from trials, along with certain results, it can be deemed promotional. You need to be really careful about who delivers the information, well, what's the context, and how they package it up. Let's not package it up. Let's just communicate the data. Do not make any claims, do not make any summary of findings. Even though another paper might do that, that's probably not in your best interest to relay findings made from other papers, if it is very close to making your product or pipeline product favourable. So essentially communicating results that include efficacy data could convey the positive attributes of a product. Now, if you're conveying data that doesn't communicate positive attributes of a product, then you're probably going to be okay. So the code's definition of promotional includes statements concerning efficacy, so statements concerning efficacy, the rate of adverse effects, or other cautionary aspects of the product and comparative information. So it's quite specific. Yeah, so I'm just in that late stage, and when you know, to avoid that risk of promotion or being perceived to be promoting that product, we would suggest sticking to communicating trial information such as the phase of the trial, the subject inclusion and exclusion data, dosage being evaluated, comparators if applicable, the duration of the trial, randomization or outcome measures, but not necessarily the outcome results. So that said, you know, communicating data, communicating information about clinical trials, it can be done, but the code does not rule this out. But it's, you know, it's a risk exercise. So you need to consider what the benefits and risks are of communicating those in relation to being understood as being promotional. Here are some little, I suppose, thoughts for you to help assess those risks. So I've gone from one extreme to the other. If you wanted to communicate clinical trial results related to a late phase trial, maybe your first in the class drug, or a head-to-head comparison between new and existing drugs, that's going to pop you into a higher risk of being perceived promotional, as opposed to a context where clinical trial has already been published, the trial results relate to approved products or indication. That's pretty easy. Communication is limited to trial information without the results. That's going to be a fairly safe space to communicate. So low risk. Again, in terms of proactive communication of those results versus reactive, that's going to alter your risk profile. If you were delivering those results to a healthcare professional who's a principal investigator for other clinical trials in the area, that's pretty I would struggle to find how that would be promotional. If the product is close to registration, and that's feeling a little bit, it's, you know, the risk is heightened. And one more set of criteria to think about, you know, if you've got a really large audience, you're presenting clinical trial data to a large audience, and a broad audience of mixed specialties. The audience are likely to be prescribers, and the company employee is presenting. That's shifting that presentation of clinical trial data into quite a high. You're enabling a situation, incidentally, that the consequence may be that the healthcare professional of a broad specialty who's not that relevant to what you're presenting, wondering why this is being done, and it doesn't feel scientific exchange to that person. As opposed to a small audience, one-to-one, easy audience of specialists in that particular area, clearly relevant to their role. So they're the kind of rationalization, that's one way of thinking through whether or not and how to share clinical trial information in that context. And a second situation or scenario could be a satellite symposium during an official congress. So a few people suggested that they really wanted to work through what scientific exchange looks like on a larger scale with a larger group of people. So you can see here already we're talking, it's a harder context to navigate. We've got proactive exchange. We've got a broad, large audience, or at least a large audience, maybe not so broad, but depends. We want to talk about an unapproved or an off-label discussion, and we have clinical trial results which we believe people want to talk about and want to hear about. So I suppose this is where you go back to those questions that I posted before, and they're up there on the screen for you. Think about how to ask yourselves those questions and see if you can change bits and pieces of that plan to shift the risk a little bit further to the left. I would suggest in this case, you have the rationale for the exchange being proactive. So the Congress will include content related to the product or its use and is likely to be referenced in the Congress. So to me, in my personal view, that gives you the rationale and the relevance. Secondly, why does the stakeholder need the information for their role? Well, the Congress attracts specialists seeking current knowledge in their field. So you already have a relevance by simple attendance. The symposium provides emerging scientific information relevant to that specialty, and attendance at this symposium is clearly optional and is based on individual interest or need. So you've got a different dynamic than just sending out information to someone you're not sure if they want or need that information. They have turned up. So you've got quite a nice match there. And in terms of proactively engaging in scientific exchange to improve patient care, the reasons for conducting that activity is to provide up-to-date scientific information on disease research and emerging therapies. And in my view, that supports the longer-term quality use of medicines and can enhance patient care. So those were relatively easy to navigate. I suppose harder would be what opportunities are available for two-way communication. Let's ensure that maybe you've got two ways. You've got a panel discussion and a question and answer segment. So a panel discussion where you've got people discussing the science. It's not one person delivering for all of that amount of time. You've got an exchange of ideas between people that's on display, and everyone's benefiting from that exchange. So you're not only viewing that panel, but you also have the ability then to feed in as the audience any clarification or questions that you might have in a dedicated Q&A session. Maybe you could even consider including another simultaneous mechanism like Slido. So not so much a poll, but where you can submit a question and those questions are rolling on the screen and are answered by the panel. Like that is exchanging questions and an answer is coming back. So that's different from the kind of poll, the curly poll thing I put in the other on the other slide about two-way exchange. So think about ways to really ramp up that two-way exchange. And lastly, but not leastly, delivery, how to make sure it's non-promotional. Well, delivery is very important in this context. So oversight is obviously needed. All the speakers need to be very well briefed, clearly no claims, really balanced information, and consider, maybe changing from your original idea to expanding the content from talking about one trial to including a broader context and the breadth of studies in that therapeutic area. Like maybe there are ways to manipulate and change your delivery in order to reduce the risk of that proactive exchange being understood or perceived to be promotional. And I think I've talked enough for today. So over to Q&A. Before I go, this is the document, the FAQ guidance that I was talking about. It's on our interactive code, and these are the 6 questions it tries to tackle. And, maybe towards the end of the year, we might add to it. Like if there's some really hot questions, we can always build on the work that we've done. And a huge shout out for that Scientific Exchange pop-up group. And if you haven't checked out our interactive code, please go and dive right in. There's a QR code that will take you straight there. And with that, we've got more resources than just the guidance. So we've got, there's about 5 notes from the help desk that you can see up on screen, which tries to tackle some bits and pieces. And that's also where you'll find the recorded code info session. So thanks so much for joining us.